The carriage reached Wycliffe Park on a Thursday in late October 1817, and Cecily Drummond's first impression of it was that someone had built a very beautiful prison and forgotten to mention it to the occupants. The house rose from the Somerset landscape with the confidence of something that had never needed to justify itself. 4 stories of pale stone, symmetrical to the point of severity, flanked by grounds that were immaculate and entirely without charm. No roses gone to hip, no gravel displaced. Even the trees stood at attention. She had the particulars of the estate in the leather satchel beside her. 3 properties, Wycliffe Park itself, a smaller holding in Taunton, and a coastal parcel near Watchet with a disputed boundary that had been in legal ambiguity for 11 years. The late Duke had engaged Drummond and Sons to resolve the boundary question in 1809. Her father had resolved it in 1811. Now the present Duke wished to consolidate all 3 holdings under a single firm for ongoing management, and had written, tersely, correctly, to request a meeting. The letter had been addressed to Mr. E. Drummond. Mr. E. Drummond had been in the ground since February. Cecily had written back as Miss C. Drummond on behalf of the firm, confirming the appointment for the 16th. She had signed it below the firm's name, which was above Mr. Hatch's name, which was the name the courts recognized as the practice's principal, and which appeared on every document that required a qualified solicitor's authority. Her own name appeared on the correspondence, because she wrote the correspondence. This was the arrangement. It worked in the way that arrangements work when everyone involved finds it more convenient than the alternative. There had been no reply to her letter. She had taken that as confirmation. The butler who received her at the door had the expression of a man whose instructions had not prepared him for this particular situation. He had been told a representative of Drummond and Sons would arrive at 2 o'clock. He had opened the door expecting someone else entirely. He recovered within 2 seconds, which she credited to his training, and showed her to a study on the ground floor, not the drawing room, the study, where business was conducted. She approved of this. She had been waiting perhaps 4 minutes, her papers arranged on the desk to the right when the Duke of Wycliffe entered. He was tall, and moved like a man who had never once considered whether there was enough space for him, because there always was. Dark-coated, no ornamentation beyond the plain gold of a watch chain. His face was administered, every feature in its correct position. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at the disputed coastal boundary, as a problem that should have been resolved before it reached his desk. Miss Drummond, not a question, but a recalibration happening behind it. "So, Your Grace." She did not rise. She was seated at his desk, her papers already arranged before her, and rising would have conceded something she hadn't decided to concede yet. A pause. He took it without visible reaction, crossed to the chair opposite, his own chair, she noted, which he approached without any suggestion that she had displaced him, and sat. His eyes moved to the papers on the desk, and then back to her. "I was given to understand," he said, "that I would meet with the firm." "You are meeting with the firm?" "I expected Mr. Hatch." "Mr. Hatch manages the qualified practice. I manage the clients." She held his gaze. "My father built Drummond and Sons over 31 years. I have worked in it for the last 7. If you require Mr. Hatch's presence for anything that must be executed in law, he can attend a subsequent meeting. For the purposes of this one, understanding your requirements, reviewing the existing files, and establishing how the firm can serve you, I am better placed than he is." She could see him processing this, not resisting it, processing it, the way he processed a legal document looking for the clause that changed the meaning of the one before it. "And if I prefer to conduct my business through Mr. Hatch directly," he said, "then you will find Mr. Hatch entirely willing and entirely reliant on the notes I will prepare for him." She kept her voice level. "The choice is yours, Your Grace, but the work will come through me either way." He looked at her for a moment that was neither hostile nor warm. Then he said, "Proceed," and reached for the first file. They worked for 2 hours. Cecily had expected friction, a ducal habit of correction, or the particular condescension of men who had never needed to read their own documents and therefore assumed no one else had. She found neither. Wycliffe was precise, well prepared, and entirely without small talk. When she raised a question about the Taunton entailment, he answered it directly. When she identified a discrepancy in the 1814 survey, he said, "I noticed that also," with no further commentary. It was, she thought, the most efficient meeting she had conducted in months. "The Watchet boundary," she said when they had moved through the Taunton material. Your father's settlement in 1811 resolved the line by agreement, not by court order. The neighbouring landowner, Petherton, has a son who came into the property last year. Young men who come into properties sometimes revisit their father's agreements.
Has he?
Not yet, but the agreement should be formalised before he thinks to. She slid the relevant page across. I would recommend we apply to have it enrolled. It is an additional cost now. It saves a considerable one later. I should tell you, however, that the Court of Chancery proceeds at its own pace. This is a matter of months at best, more likely years. What matters is that the application is on record. He read the page, line by line, without haste. Do it, he said. She made a note. I'll prepare the application within the fortnight. Mr. Hatch will execute it. He set the page down. The ongoing management arrangement. My previous solicitor billed by the item and was consistently inexact about which items a given matter required. That is a common arrangement, Cecily said carefully. I am aware it is common. I dislike it. He looked at the file before him. I would prefer an agreed schedule, standard rates for correspondence, travel and document preparation, fixed in advance, with separate rates for contentious matters. I want to know what I am paying before I have paid it. She had prepared for this. She reached into her satchel and produced a sheet. I have drafted a proposed schedule. It follows the standard taxable costs as a floor. You will find our rates for routine correspondence at the lower end of what the profession charges, and our rates for contentious work at the higher, because contentious work done well is cheaper than contentious work done twice. He read it. She watched him read it and waited. Item 6, he said. Travel expenses. You have listed a per-mile rate. Standard. If I require the firm's representative to attend the park regularly, the per-mile cost becomes the largest item on the account. Then I would suggest, Your Grace, that you consider what regular attendance is worth to you, and we can discuss a fixed sum for visits within an agreed frequency. A pause. 4 visits per year included. Additional visits at the listed rate. 4 visits is insufficient for 3 active properties. 6. 5. 5, she agreed. He set the schedule down. I'll have my secretary confirm the engagement. I will review the confirmation on receipt. She reached for her satchel. There is one further matter. She did not look up from gathering her papers. The file will be held in my father's name, as the firm's founding name. Correspondence will come from Mr. Hatch as principal of record. But if you have a substantive question about any of your matters, Your Grace, it will be answered more quickly if you write to me directly. A silence. I will do that, he said, which was not the answer she had expected. She clasped her satchel and stood. I trust the arrangement will prove, Miss Drummond, he said, with the slight formality of a man closing a ledger, to mutual satisfaction. She looked at him once directly. That remains to be seen, Your Grace. She walked to the door and did not look back, but she was aware, with the precision of someone who has spent years reading what rooms do not say, that he did not move until she had left the room entirely. She returned to Wycliffe Park nearly 3 weeks later, and twice more before Christmas. The engagement had been confirmed. Cecily had reviewed the secretary's letter, noted that it addressed itself to Mr. J. Hatch as principal, and filed it without comment. The substance was correct. The work began. For practical purposes, the arrangement functioned as she had described in the study. Mr. Hatch's name appeared on the executed documents. His qualification gave them legal weight, and Cecily knew every clause of every file. She returned to the park on the 5th of November, with the Chancery application prepared, and 3 questions about the Taunton property that could not be resolved by paper alone. This time, Wycliffe's butler received her without visible surprise. The study was ready. The desk had been cleared to the right. Ooh. She did not mention it, neither did he. The Chancery application took 40 minutes. Wycliffe read it in full, asked 2 questions that demonstrated he had read it carefully, and raised a 3rd point she had not anticipated, a procedural matter regarding the 1811 agreement's original signatories, one of whom had since died. His executor will need to confirm the agreement transfers to the new boundary, Cecily said, writing in the margin. I'll need to trace him. His name was Coulson. His son is in Bristol. She looked up. You knew this already. I looked into it when I decided to formalize the boundary. No apology in his tone, simply the fact stated. I did not know whether it would prove relevant. She wrote Coulson, Bristol in the margin. If you find yourself in possession of information you have judged possibly irrelevant, I would be grateful if you mentioned it at the beginning of a meeting rather than the end." He was quiet for a half-second. "Noted," he said, and she had the clear impression that he was not accustomed to being instructed on method and was, not resisting it, logging it. The Taunton questions required longer. One of them, tenant right on the eastern parcels, where two families had farmed the same land under overlapping informal arrangements for 30 years, drew them into a disagreement. Wycliffe's position was clean. The arrangements were undocumented, therefore legally void. The land was his to dispose of as the estate required. Cecily's position was that legally void and practically unenforceable were not the same thing, and that a duke who displaced two families with 30 years of reasonable expectation would find himself before a Taunton magistrate within the year, before a judge who had likely grown up knowing families exactly like them. "You are advising me on the politics of the matter," Wycliffe said. "I am advising you on the outcome, which is what the retainer is for. My father resolved such situations efficiently. Your father's resolution of the 1811 boundary left a technicality that has now required us to trace a dead man's son in Bristol." She kept her voice even. Efficiency and resolution are not always the same thing. He was very still. She had the sensation of having located a door she hadn't known was there, not opening it, only finding it. "Draft a formal arrangement for the tenants," he said. "Document the existing situation and provide a clear framework going forward. Fair terms, but documented. A 20-year lease with right of renewal at fixed rents? If that is your recommendation." "It is." "Then proceed." The disagreement was over, not because he had surrendered, but because he had recognized the better argument and done so without making a production of it. She found this, against her expectations, genuinely pleasant to work with. The rain began sometime in the second hour and did not stop. By 4 o'clock the light had gone flat and grey. Cecily's coachman had taken the carriage to the stables. He would not, the footman confirmed, be bringing it out until the weather eased. "You are welcome to wait in the library," Wycliffe said. It was what one said when a professional associate was stranded on one's property by Somerset weather because the alternatives were worse. The library was warmer than the study and less severe. The books had been acquired across several generations. Older shelves held volumes with cracked spines, the newer ones arranged with the same precision as everything else in the house. There was a fire and 2 chairs angled toward it, and a small table between them with a branch of candles. Wycliffe did not leave her there. She had expected him to. He took the other chair and they sat for several minutes without speaking. The rain was sufficient conversation. "Your father built the practice over 31 years, he said at last. He qualified in 1786. The London office opened the same year. He died in February. You said you have been working in it for 7 years. Since I was 19, the last 3 running it in effect while his health declined." She looked at the fire. "Mr. Hatch is 63 and wishes chiefly to retire without incident. Mr. Fenwick manages documents well and people poorly. Martha Briggs runs the office and is worth 3 of either of them. And none of them can be the firm's principal going forward. Not in any way that builds it, no." He was quiet. "So you are looking for a qualified partner?" "I am looking for the right one. Someone who understands that Drummond & Sons is not a shell to be filled with another man's practice." She paused. "They exist. I have not found one yet." Outside, the rain struck the window in irregular gusts. The fire settled. "Why did you choose Drummond & Sons?" she said. "Specifically, you could have engaged any firm in Bath." He considered this, which meant he was going to answer honestly. "Your father's resolution of the Watchet boundary in 1811 was uncommon. Most solicitors would have taken it to court. He found a settlement both parties could accept without anyone losing face. That quality of judgment is not something one finds in every firm's letterhead." Cecily looked at the fire. "No," she said, "it isn't." She left before 7, the rain having eased enough to permit the carriage. The visit had run 3 hours past any professional necessity. She sat with her hands folded on her lap as the carriage moved through the dark and noted without dwelling on it that the 3 hours had not felt long. Martha was still at the office when she returned. Kettle on, correspondence sorted, the expression of a woman who had noted the departure time and the arrival time and was engaged in her own private arithmetic. "The application is ready for Mr. Hatch to sign," Cecily said, setting her satchel on the desk. "The tenant matter requires drafting, and there is a Coulson in Bristol to be traced. I'll write to Bristol tomorrow." Martha set a cup of tea at her elbow. And the Duke? Efficient, Cecily said. Said Martha. It was not a particularly large sound, but it had syntax. Cecily did not ask what it meant. She opened the next file. She returned to Wycliffe Park on the 2nd of December. The tenant drafts were complete. They required Wycliffe's review before Mr. Hatch could execute them. She told herself this was the reason for the visit, and was aware by the time the carriage turned into the drive, and she saw the pale stone house against the winter sky, that she had not once considered sending the drafts by post. The threat, when she recognized it, arrived not as a feeling but as an accounting, the way she sometimes audited a ledger and found that the figures, each individually correct, summed to something she had not expected. The work was nearly finished. The Chancery application was filed. The tenant leases were drafted. In another few weeks, the active work that had brought her here would resolve into routine correspondence, the kind that passed between firms and clients without requiring anyone to cross half of Somerset. The retainer would continue. She would not. She opened her satchel as the carriage stopped. The drafts were in the front pocket. She knew every clause. The butler had the door open before she reached it. London in February was not the season. It was the anticipation of it. Families returning from the country, townhouses opened and aired, morning calls beginning again, with the careful, rusty quality of machinery starting after a long winter. The people who moved through it in February were not yet performing. Cecily found this useful. She had not intended to attend Lady Forsyth's musical evening. Martha had pointed out, with the economy she brought to observations she expected to be contested, that Lady Forsyth was wife to Sir Edmund Forsyth, whose Wiltshire estate shared a surveyor with 2 of Wycliffe's Somerset properties, and who had inquired through a mutual acquaintance whether Drummond and Sons was accepting new clients. A professional courtesy to attend, Martha said. Cecily had agreed, and was now standing in a Mayfair drawing-room on a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of February, listening to a young woman play Clementi with considerably more ambition than accuracy. She knew 6 people in the room. She had been speaking with Sir Edmund for perhaps 10 minutes. The Wiltshire properties complications were genuine, and his need for a solicitor's firm genuine also, when she became aware, without looking up, that someone had entered behind her. She knew before she turned. She did not examine this. Wycliffe crossed the room with the same unhurried certainty he brought to his own study. He accepted a glass he did not drink, was immediately engaged by a man Cecily did not recognize, and did not look in her direction. She turned back to Sir Edmund. The Clementi continued. 20 minutes later, between one piece and the next, Wycliffe arrived at her side. The room had fractured into conversation. He gave a slight bow, correct and unhurried. "Miss Drummond?" "Your Grace." Sir Edmund, who had been mid-sentence about drainage rights, stopped and looked between them with the particular attention of a man revising a situation. "You are acquainted," he said. "Miss Drummond manages my Somerset affairs through Drummond and Sons." Wycliffe said it without hesitation. "I have found the firm thorough, and disinclined to resolve a matter cheaply when it can be resolved correctly." Sir Edmund smiled the smile of a man who had received considerably more than he asked for. He turned to Cecily with a new quality of interest, not the interest he had shown when he thought her a solicitor's assistant come to canvass for clients, but something that recalibrated her position in the room. He asked about her availability. She named a date. They agreed, and by the time that was settled, Wycliffe had moved away to speak with someone else. She did not look after him. But she was aware from the moment of that exchange onward of a change in the room's attention. Nothing overt. A glance exchanged between 2 women near the fireplace, a conversation that paused a half-beat as she passed. Lady Forsyth, when she came to refill Cecily's glass, lingered. "You manage Wycliffe's estates?" Stated, not asked. "The firm holds a retainer for legal management, yes." How singular. A smile that arrived and then looked at her. Wycliffe is not in the habit of recommending people. "He recommended the firm," Cecily said, "on its merits." "So of course," said Lady Forsyth, and moved away. Cecily finished her lemonade, made her farewells within the half-hour, and was in a hired carriage by 10. She looked at the dark street and thought about the word singular and everything it had meant in Lady Forsyth's mouth, and whether there was a single thing she could have said that would have closed that conversation rather than continued it. She could think of nothing. Martha was still at the office when she arrived. Late hours were not unusual when the correspondence had fallen behind. Cecily set her cloak on the hook and sat down opposite her without preamble. Wycliffe was at the Forsyth evening. Martha set down her pen. He gave me a professional reference to Sir Edmund, directly in the middle of the room. Cecily folded her hands on the desk. In front of people who will now go home and describe it to other people. And Lady Forsyth. Noticed immediately. Martha picked up her pen, completed the sentence she had been writing, set it down again. People will not assume the truth, she said, which is that he considers the firm competent. They will assume something more interesting, because something more interesting is available to be assumed. She looked at Cecily directly. He is 34 and unmarried. You are in his house 5 times in 4 months, and now in his company in a Mayfair drawing room. The arithmetic is not complicated. The arithmetic, Cecily said, is entirely wrong. Yes, that is not what I said. The office was quiet. The coals settled in the grate. From the street came the faint sound of a carriage passing. It could harm the practice, Martha said, not unkindly but without softening it. I know. If people conclude the retainer was obtained by means other than... I know, Martha. Martha nodded once. She returned to her correspondence. Cecily sat with her hands on the desk and thought about Wycliffe Park in November. The study with the desk cleared to the right, the library in the rain, the 3 hours that had not felt long. She thought about thorough, said without looking at her, as though it were simply a fact being reported. She thought about the word singular. The season, she calculated, was 6 weeks away. She had, by her own accounting, done nothing wrong. She had managed a professional arrangement with competence and discretion. She had attended a social evening for legitimate reasons. She had said nothing, done nothing, revealed nothing. The difficulty, and she sat with it the way she sat with a problematic clause, turning it to find the flaw, was that discretion and distance were not precisely the same thing, and she was no longer entirely certain she had maintained both. She did not share this observation with Martha. Martha, she suspected, had already made it. The Forsyth consultation, Cecily said instead. I've agreed to the 21st. I'll put it in the book, Martha said, and picked up her pen again. The season arrived in April like a creditor, expected and still unwelcome. Cecily had attended 4 events by the 3rd week of the month, all of them defensible on professional grounds. Sir Edmund Forsyth had become a client, and Sir Edmund moved in circles that overlapped with half of Somerset's landowning families, which meant that Cecily's presence at a dinner or an evening concert could, with reasonable honesty, be filed under business development. Martha noted each engagement in the appointments book and said nothing, which was a form of commentary Cecily had learned to read with some precision. The ball at Harrington House on the 22nd of April was different. She had not planned to attend. The invitation had come through Lady Forsyth, not a formal card but a handwritten addition to Lady Forsyth's own invitation, which meant it could not be declined without consequence and could not be accepted without implication. Martha had read it over Cecily's shoulder on a Tuesday morning. You'll go, Martha said. I had not decided. You'll go, Martha said and returned to her desk. Cecily went. She wore her mother's grey silk, altered twice since she had inherited it, with the pearl earrings that had been her father's last gift, the ones she wore when she needed to feel the ground was solid. The maid she shared with the lodging-house's other tenant dressed her hair without artistry but without disaster, and by 8 o'clock she was in a hired carriage moving through Mayfair, telling herself this was a professional obligation and nothing more. She was not entirely convincing. Harrington House was everything Wycliffe Park was not, crowded, bright, and performing itself enthusiastically for everyone in it. The ballroom held perhaps 200 people, and smelled of candles and powder and the particular anxiety of mothers with daughters to place. Cecily accepted a glass of lemonade she did not intend to drink, and positioned herself near enough to Lady Forsyth to satisfy the social obligation and far enough from the dancing to avoid the obligation of participating in it. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she saw Wycliffe. He was near the far end of the room, speaking with 2 men she did not know, and he was, she noted this with the detachment she applied to observations she did not wish to examine, entirely composed. He wore black and white with the same absence of ornament he always wore, and he stood with the particular stillness she had come to understand was not indifference but concentration. He was listening to the man on his left with the same quality of attention he brought to a page of legal text. Then he looked up across the room and found her. She did not look away in time. Or perhaps she did not try to. He excused himself within a minute. She watched him cross the room. Not directly, he stopped twice, which gave her time to set her glass on a passing tray and compose her expression, and arrived at her side with the same slight bow he always gave her. "Miss Drummond?" "Your Grace, I did not know you were expected this evening." "Nor are you." A pause. "Lady Forsyth." "Lady Forsyth," she confirmed. They stood side by side facing the room, which gave them the useful cover of appearing to observe the dancing rather than to be in conversation. Around them, the ball turned and glittered and watched, because a room of 200 people trained to notice exactly. This sort of thing does not miss it. "The watch-it enrollment," he said. "Filed. We wait on the court's pace as I said we would." The Coulson executor confirmed. "Last month, Mr. Hatch has the signed confirmation on file." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, then in a register that was slightly different from his professional one, not softer but differently weighted. "Miss Drummond, would you walk with me?" It was not quite a question. It was also not a command. It was the voice of a man who had decided to ask something and had not quite managed to make it optional. She considered the room, Lady Forsyth 12 feet away, the watching already well underway, and inclined her head. They moved together along the room's edge, through the doors at the far end, and into a corridor that gave onto a terrace. The night air was cool and smelled of new leaves and the distant city. 2 lanterns hung at the terrace's corners, casting light that reached the stone railing and no further. Beyond it, the garden was dark. They were alone. Cecily turned to face him and waited. Wycliffe stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture she knew, working something through. She had seen it over the Taunton files and in the library at the park. She waited for the version of it she did not yet know. "I have been considering the matter of the firm," he said. She said nothing. "You have said you require a partner, someone who understands the practice's history and does not intend to absorb it." He paused. "You have also said the right person has not yet presented themselves." "That is correct." "I have a proposal." He said it with the clean precision he brought to everything. "There is a practical difficulty in the current arrangement that will only increase as the season continues. You have been seen at my properties. You have been seen in my company. There is already talk, I am aware of it, and I know you are also." "I am." "The talk is not injurious yet, but it will become so, particularly to you and to the reputation of the firm, if the situation is left without a structure that the world can comprehend." He met her eyes. "A marriage, of the practical kind. Your position would be beyond question. The practice would continue. The work is yours and should remain so. You would retain whatever independence the law permits. The terms could be—" He stopped. Something crossed his face, not hesitation, more like a man who has heard himself and found the sound unsatisfactory. He looked away from her, toward the dark garden. A full 5 seconds passed. Then he said, "I'm going to begin that again." Cecily was very still. "I have spent the last 6 months," he said slowly, as though the words were being produced one at a time from somewhere he did not often access, "finding reasons to require your presence at Wycliffe Park. The boundary enrollment did not require 5 visits. The tenant leases required 1, possibly 2. I'm aware of this, I've been aware of it for some time." He did not look at her while he said it, and then he did, directly. "The talk is a problem. The firm's reputation is a problem. But they are not why I am standing here." The terrace was quiet. Inside the ballroom, a new set was beginning. "Why are you standing here?" she said. "Because the thought of this arrangement concluding, the work finishing, no further reason to—" He stopped again, took one breath. "Because I do not want you to stop coming to Wycliffe Park. And the reason has nothing to do with the legal management of the estates." Another pause, shorter. "I would like to marry you, not as an arrangement, I am asking." Cecily looked at him. She looked at the careful line of his shoulders, the deliberate steadiness of his gaze, the hands that had unclenched from behind his back somewhere during that speech and now hung at his sides, open. She thought about the desk cleared to the right, the library in the rain and the hours that did not feel long, the word thorough said in a drawing room, as though it was simply a fact. She thought about the letter that had said, "I find I am not certain how to write it," and the 6 months of a man constructing reasons to see her, and the 5 seconds of silence in which he had heard himself and started over. She looked at him for a long moment. "Say it once more," she said quietly, "without the structure." He held her gaze. I want to marry you, Miss Drummond, because I would very much rather you were present in my life than not. That is the whole of it. The lantern light moved slightly in the April air. That, Cecily said, is considerably more honest than your first attempt. Yes. I am not going to answer you tonight. He absorbed this without flinching. I understand. I don't think you do entirely. I am not refusing, I am not accepting. I am telling you that a question like that one deserves more than a terrace and one evening's courage. She held his gaze. Ask me again. When you are certain it is not circumstance prompting you, when the talk has died down and the retainer is concluded and there is no practical reason left, ask me then, if you still want to. I will still want to. Then it will keep, she said. She went back inside. She stayed another half hour, long enough to satisfy the social requirement of having attended, and then collected her cloak and left. In the carriage home, she sat with her hands in her lap and felt, beneath the steadiness she had held through all of it, something she did not immediately have a name for. Not relief, not fear. Something that was neither. She named it eventually before the carriage reached her street. Hope? She had not felt it in some time, and she had apparently not lost the ability to recognize it. Martha said nothing the following morning. This was unusual enough that Cecily stopped in the doorway. You've heard, Cecily said. Lady Forsyth called at 9:30. Martha set a cup of tea on the desk without looking up. She was concerned for your health. She was also concerned for a number of other things, none of which she named directly. What did you tell her? That you were in excellent health and fully occupied with the Forsyth retainer, which seemed to disappoint her. Martha sat. She mentioned that you and the Duke had stepped onto the terrace together. Briefly. She did not use the word briefly. Cecily took off her coat. The talk will be considerable. It will be very considerable. Martha folded her hands on the desk. What happened on the terrace? Cecily sat down. She looked at the morning correspondence unopened. He asked me to marry him. Martha was very still. Not as an arrangement. He began to frame it as one, caught himself, and started again. Cecily set her hands flat on the desk. He said he wanted to marry me because he would rather I were present in his life than not. Those were the words. A silence in which Martha appeared to be revising several things simultaneously. And you said? I told him to ask me again. Once the professional arrangement had concluded and there was no circumstance to prompt him. If he still wished to then, I would hear it. Martha was quiet for a long moment. That was either very wise or very difficult. Both, Cecily said. File them under the same heading. They worked through the morning. Cecily drafted correspondence for the Forsyth retainer, reviewed the Taunton accounts that had arrived the previous week, and wrote a note to Mr. Coulson's executor regarding a secondary point on the Watchet enrollment. She did everything with complete accuracy, and at no point thought about a man standing on a terrace with his hands open at his sides, saying, "That is the whole of it." She thought about it a great deal. Martha left at midday for the stationer's. Mr. Hatch was with a client. Mr. Fenwick had gone to record a deed at the office in Chancery Lane. Cecily was alone in the office at her father's desk, with the morning's work finished and the afternoon's not yet begun, when she allowed herself briefly and without indulgence to think. She thought about what she had told him. Ask me when there is no practical reason left, and whether she had been honest, or whether she had been, in the way she sometimes was, too careful. She thought about the word careful, and what it had cost her, used as a rule rather than a choice. She thought about her father, who had been careful, and the practice which was surviving because of it, and the question of whether surviving and living were as closely related as she had been assuming. She thought about the library in the rain, how the 2 hours had not felt long. She picked up her pen and began the afternoon's work. On the third day after the ball, a letter arrived. No crest on the seal, she noticed this, but the handwriting on the outside was one she knew. She had seen it in the margin of the tenant drafts. Well drafted. She looked at it for longer than was necessary. Then she opened it. Miss Drummond, I have done what you asked. I have considered whether it is circumstance speaking and concluded it is not, as circumstance has been available to speak for some months, and I managed until recently to keep it from doing so. I have no intention of pressing you. I simply wanted you to have this information in advance of any future conversation, so that when it occurs, you will not need to wonder whether I have thought about it. I have thought about very little else. Yours, etc. Wycliffe. She read it twice. She set it down. She picked it up and read it a third time, which she noted with some irony was 3 more times than she had read any other letter from him, though none of the others had required it. She did not answer immediately. She sat with it for the remainder of the afternoon, in the way she sat with a difficult clause, not forcing the interpretation, letting it settle until it yielded the right one. That evening she wrote, "Your Grace, the information is noted and appreciated. I find that I also have very little to report on the subject of thinking about other things. C. Drummond." She sent it before she could revise it. In the days that followed, the talk did not die down. It had not had enough time to, but it shifted in character. Lady Forsyth's version, which featured a private rendezvous and implications she had left strategically unstated, circulated through the drawing rooms of 3 Mayfair streets. Sir Edmund Forsyth, who was both a new client and a man of some social weight, mentioned in passing at his club that Miss Drummond was the most rigorous legal mind he had encountered since her late father, and that Wycliffe had been right to recommend the firm. This did not stop the talk. It did, however, complicate it. Martha reported all of this without editorial comment, which was itself editorial comment. "The practice," Cecily said one morning, "has 3 new inquiries this week," Martha said. 2 from gentlemen who appear to have heard of you through Sir Edmund, 1 from a woman whose husband's estate is in dispute, who appears to have heard of you through Lady Forsyth, which suggests Lady Forsyth is operating in ways she has not entirely calculated. Cecily looked at her. "The talk is making us visible." "Visibility is not always a liability," Martha said. "It depends what people see when they look." Cecily considered this. "And what do they see?" Martha set down her pen. A young woman running her late father's practice with enough ability that a duke of the first rank recommended her publicly, in a room full of witnesses, without hesitation. She paused. "Some people see scandal. The useful ones see something else." 3 weeks after the ball, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of May, Cecily arrived at the office to find Mr. Hatch waiting for her, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not distress, but something adjacent to it, worn by a man who has been presented with a question he is not equipped to answer. "A gentleman called yesterday afternoon," Mr. Hatch said, "while you were at the Forsyth offices. He wished to discuss the possibility of a partnership arrangement with the firm." Cecily set down her satchel. "Which gentleman?" Mr. Hatch handed her his card. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at Mr. Hatch, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has set a thing down very carefully and is waiting to see whether it falls. The card read, "Julian Vane, Duke of Wycliffe." "He left his direction," Mr. Hatch said. "He said he would wait on your convenience." Cecily set the card on the desk. She looked at it for another moment. Then she reached for her coat. "Tell Mr. Fenwick he has the afternoon correspondence," she said. "Where shall I say you've gone?" "On a professional call," she said, and went. His townhouse was in Brook Street, less imposing than Wycliffe Park, but carrying the same quality of precision, as though it had been instructed to present itself correctly and had complied. The butler received her without visible surprise, which meant, she thought, that Wycliffe had prepared him. This was, in its small way, a form of evidence. She was shown to the library. He was there, standing by the window, and he turned when she entered with an expression she recognized, not the administered neutrality of their first meeting, but the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for something and was now assessing whether it had arrived. "Miss Drummond," he did not move toward her, "I did not expect you today. Your card said you would wait on my convenience." She sat down without invitation, which was her habit, and which she thought he had by now come to understand. "This is my convenience." He sat, the room settled around them. "The partnership," she said. "Yes." "You called on the office." "I thought it more appropriate than writing." A pause. "And I find that I have been writing to you for 3 weeks, and it is insufficient." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved toward performance. "You told me to ask again," he said, when the arrangement had concluded and there was no practical reason left. "The arrangement has not concluded." "No, but I find I cannot arrange my feelings on a schedule, which is itself, I think, the answer to the question you actually asked." He held her gaze steadily. "You asked me to come back when I was certain it was not circumstance." "I am certain. The circumstance has been inconvenient, frankly, and I would marry you without it if I could." "That is not a very romantic formulation," she said. "No." A pause. I am trying to be honest rather than elegant. I was given to understand that honesty was the requirement. It is, she said. I only note that the two are not mutually exclusive. The faintest thing crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the near neighborhood of one. Cecily, he said. It was the first time. He said it simply, without announcement. Will you marry me? She sat with it for a moment. Not the pause of uncertainty, but the pause of a woman who has waited a long time for something and intends to feel the full weight of its arrival. Yes, she said, I will. He was very still. Then I should tell you the practice remains mine, she said. That is a condition, not a negotiation. I know. He met her eyes. I would not have it otherwise. It is yours. It should stay yours. And Mr. Hatch will continue as principal of record until we find the right qualified partner. That has not changed. Agreed. And I will come to Wycliffe Park when the work requires it, and for no stated reason when it does not, and the world may make of that whatever it likes. The world, he said, is welcome to. She stood up. He stood also, which brought him close. Closer than the study, closer than the terrace, the precise distance at which professional arrangement ended and something else began. You said, she told him, in our first meeting that you trusted the arrangement would prove to mutual satisfaction. I remember. You said it the way your father would have said it, she said, as a closing, as a door being shut. He was quiet. I would like it, she said, to mean something else. He looked at her. Outside the Brook Street window, London continued its indifferent May, entirely unaware that something inside the house had just been decided. He reached out and took her hand. Not with the formality of a greeting, simply took it, the way one takes something one has been careful not to reach for and has finally stopped being careful about. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. He kissed her then, once quiet, entirely certain. The kind of kiss that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She had expected, if this moment ever arrived, to feel the vertigo of something new. Instead, she felt the exact opposite, the solid, uncomplicated sensation of arriving at a place one has been approaching for a long time without knowing it. When she stepped back, her hand was still in his. The work, she said after a moment, because it was still her habit, and he had apparently decided to find this charming rather than inconvenient. Always, he said. She came to Wycliffe Park on a Thursday in June, as she had done half a dozen times before, but the drive felt different in a way she no longer attempted to name, because she had named it, and naming it had made it hers. May had turned Somerset extravagant. The beeches were in full leaf. The drive bordered with something in white she now knew to be hawthorn because she had asked on a previous visit and been told by Wycliffe with the brief precision of a man who knows his own land. The house itself looked, for the first time, less like a beautifully maintained argument and more like a place that someone might, under the right circumstances, be glad to live in. She had been glad to live in worse. Wycliffe met her at the door, not the butler. This had become, in the month since Brook Street, a quiet habit, one of the small, unremarkable things that had accumulated between them, the way solid things do, without ceremony. She received it without comment, and they walked together through the hall and into the study where the desk had been cleared, as always to the right. There was tea. There were also, spread across the left half of the desk, 3 documents she had not prepared and did not recognize. She set down her satchel and looked at them. The Consolidated Management Agreement, he said, taking his chair. My secretary redrafted it. I have made 2 amendments. She sat and drew the first page toward her. She read it with the same attention she gave everything, line by line, not performing the reading but doing it. The amendments were in his handwriting, marginal and precise. The first was to Clause 3, the billing schedule for contentious matters. He had revised the upper rate downward and added a provision requiring his written approval before any contentious matter exceeded a specified sum. She looked at this for a moment. You have capped yourself, she said. I have capped the firm's exposure to my disputes, he said. It is a discipline. I have several properties and a historical tendency to regard legal problems as solvable by expenditure. I had noticed, she said. She kept her voice even, but something in it must have given her away because the corner of his mouth moved. She moved to the second amendment. Clause 9, termination. He had removed the 60-day withdrawal clause entirely and replaced it with a provision that either party might terminate on reasonable grounds upon 90 days written notice, subject to the completion of any matter already in progress. She looked up. You extended it, she said. I removed the asymmetry. He met her eyes. The original clause allowed the firm to withdraw on 60 days' notice and required me to give 90. It was a concession I made because I wanted the arrangement concluded quickly. The circumstances have changed. She looked at the clause again. The new version was, she thought, fairer, genuinely fairer, not merely advantageous to him. She picked up her pen and initialed it. The third document was not an amendment. It was a separate sheet, shorter than the others, written entirely in his hand. She read it once. She read it again. It was a letter of undertaking, addressed to Miss C. Drummond in her capacity as Managing Director of Drummond & Sons. It committed the Duke of Wycliffe to the following: that upon their marriage, the practice of Drummond & Sons would remain the sole professional property of Miss Drummond, that no claim upon its assets, client list, or goodwill would be made by the Wycliffe estate or its trustees, that the practice's name would not be altered without her written consent, and that any qualified solicitor engaged as partner would be engaged at her sole discretion. It was not a legal document. It had no formal standing. It was a man writing down in his own hand everything he had said he would not take from her, committing it to paper, not because she had required it, but because he understood, finally, that she needed to see it written. She set the page down. She did not trust herself to speak immediately. "It holds no legal weight," he said, not apologetically, simply accurately. "I know. I'm aware that as your husband I could, in law—" "I know what the law permits," she said. "That is not the point." "No," he said. "The point is that I wanted you to have it in writing." She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she picked up her pen and signed her name at the bottom of it, not because it required a signature, but because some things deserved to be witnessed, even if only by the two people in the room. She slid it back across the desk to him. He looked at her signature, and then he signed beneath it. She drew the consolidated agreement toward her. She read it through in full, all 11 clauses, including the 2 he had amended and the 9 she already knew, and found it sound. She turned to the final page and signed below Mr. Hatch's signature, which had been obtained the previous week and which she had witnessed herself. She set the pen down. The agreement was signed. The study was warm. Outside the window, June light lay across the lawn in long, unhurried lines. Somewhere in the garden, a wood pigeon was making its slow, circling argument to the afternoon. "There is something I should like to say," she told him. He looked at her. "In our first meeting," she said, "you closed the discussion with a phrase. You used it as your father would have, as a conclusion, a way of shutting something." She held his gaze. "I told you once that it would mean something different if I were to say it. I said it in the park in June, and I meant it then. I want to say it again now, with the papers signed and everything accounted for, so that you understand what I mean by it." He was very still, listening the way he listened to things that mattered. "This," she said, "our marriage, this work, this life, it is to mutual satisfaction. Not because the terms are agreed, because I choose it, because you have given me cause to choose it." She paused. That is what the phrase means, when it is chosen rather than inherited. Julian Vane, Duke of Wycliffe, who had been taught by a man who regarded warmth as a liability, looked at her across a cleared desk in a study in Somerset and said nothing for a moment that cost him nothing. The first such moment, she thought, in a very long time. Then he said, "I find I am entirely in agreement." She almost laughed. She felt it rise and let it briefly, a small real thing unguarded. He rose from his chair. She rose from hers. He came around the desk with the unhurried certainty of a man who has stopped calculating whether he has the right to close a distance because he has accepted that he does. He kissed her in the study of Wycliffe Park, with the signed agreement on the desk between them, and the June light coming through the window, and the wood pigeon outside entirely indifferent to the occasion. Then they went out into the afternoon. The carriage came around at 4 as requested. The groom held the door. Cecily's satchel went up first. Lighter than it usually was, she thought, or perhaps only carried differently. She turned at the step. Wycliffe was behind her. He had his coat and his hat, and the expression of a man who had made a decision some weeks ago, and was finding it, upon examination, exactly as sound as he had calculated. He handed her in, and then he followed, which was not what usually happened, and which the groom received without visible reaction, because the groom had apparently been briefed better than the butler had been in October. The door closed. The carriage began to move. Cecily looked out the window as the park fell away behind them. The pale stone house, the immaculate grounds, the beaches in their full June extravagance, and thought about the first time she had made this journey, alone, with a satchel full of files, and a careful professional distance she had maintained with both hands. She thought about every visit since, and the slow incremental accumulation of a thing she had not named, because naming it felt like a concession she hadn't agreed to make. She had agreed to it now. It had cost her nothing she was not glad to have spent. Beside her, Wycliffe was reading. He had produced a folded document from his coat pocket, with the calm of a man who considers a carriage an entirely reasonable place to conduct business, and who had not yet understood that this was going to become a long-running domestic observation. She looked at him for a moment, at the precise tilt of his head, and the unhurried movement of his eyes across the page, and the absolute, characteristic absence of performance, and felt, quietly and without vertigo, that she was sitting in exactly the right place. "Clause 3 of the Taunton lease," he said, without looking up. "I have a question." "Of course you do," she said. He looked up then, and she saw it. The thing she had watched arrive slowly over 7 months, visible now without obstruction. Not a smile exactly, though it lived near one. Something more particular than that. He showed her the clause, she read it. She told him what it meant. The carriage moved on through the Somerset afternoon toward London, carrying both of them.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.